The carriage wheel cracked against a stone in the road, and Elena Whitmore was thrown forward so hard her forehead struck the window frame. Rain hammered the roof like fists. Somewhere behind them, in the dark, a horse screamed, and the driver cursed and pulled hard on the reins. Elena pressed a hand to her head and looked out into the storm, and that was when she saw the house for the first time, rising out of the black hills like something that had been waiting for her. Ashcombe Hall did not look like a home. It looked like a warning. She had taken the position out of necessity, not choice. Her father's debts had swallowed everything her family once owned, and when the letter came offering a post as companion to Lady Beatrice Ashwood, aunt to the Duke, Elena had not hesitated. She had packed one trunk, said goodbye to no one who mattered, and traveled 3 days north into country she did not know, toward a family she had never met. The carriage stopped at last before the great doors, and a woman in gray was already waiting on the steps, holding a lamp against the wind. She did not smile. "You must be Miss Whitmore," the woman said. "I am Mrs. Bellamy, the housekeeper. You are late. The Duke does not like lateness." "The storm delayed us," Elena said, stepping down into the mud. "The storm delays everyone who comes here," Mrs. Bellamy answered, and something in the way she said it made Elena's skin prickle, though she could not have said why. Inside, the hall was vast and cold, lit by candles that seemed to fight a losing battle against the shadows. Portraits lined the walls, generations of Ashwood faces staring down with the same sharp cheekbones and pale eyes. Elena noticed that one frame, larger than the rest, hung empty of its subject, the canvas turned to face the wall, as though someone could not bear to look at it, or could not bear to be looked at. "This way," Mrs. Bellamy said, already climbing the stairs. "Lady Beatrice is asleep. You will meet her in the morning. Tonight you will rest." Elena followed her up 2 flights, down a long corridor, where the candlelight seemed to shrink rather than grow, and stopped before a heavy oak door at the very end of the hall. Mrs. Bellamy's hand hesitated on the handle for a moment longer than it should have. "This is your room," she said. "It's very grand for a companion," Elena said, trying to sound light, though the house had already stolen any lightness from her chest. "It was not always a companion's room," Mrs. Bellamy said, and pushed the door open. The chamber inside was larger than any bedroom Elena had ever slept in. A great 4-poster bed stood against the far wall, its curtains a deep, faded green. A fireplace crackled with a fire someone had lit in preparation, though the room still felt colder than the corridor outside it, and on the dressing table, catching the firelight, lay a single silver hairpin, resting exactly in the center, as though someone had set it there only moments ago and meant to return for it. "Whose room was this?" Elena asked. Mrs. Bellamy's face did not change, but her voice dropped. "It belonged to the old Duke, before him. It has not been slept in for 6 years. His Grace ordered it prepared for you, because it is the only guest chamber, with a working chimney in this wing." She paused at the door. "You will find everything you need. If you require anything else, ring the bell. Good night, Miss Whitmore." "Wait," Elena said. "Why hasn't anyone slept here in 6 years?" Mrs. Bellamy did not turn around. "Because His Grace asked that no one be given this room. Until now." And then she was gone, her footsteps fading down the corridor, leaving Elena alone with the fire. The empty portrait frame she had passed in the hall still burned into her mind, and the small silver hairpin gleaming on the table, like a question no one wanted to answer. Elena did not sleep well that first night. The wind found every gap in the old windows and turned them into low, mournful notes, and twice she woke certain she had heard footsteps pause just outside her door, though when she rose and opened it, the corridor was empty and dark. In the morning, sunlight thinned the fear the night had built, and Elena told herself she had imagined it. She dressed and went down to meet Lady Beatrice, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, who looked her over from head to foot and declared her thin but tolerable. "You'll do," Lady Beatrice said. "The last girl cried within a week. I do hope you're made of sterner stuff." "I hope so too, my lady," Elena said. "Good. Now, tell me, did Mrs. Bellamy put you in the West Chamber?" Elena hesitated. "I believe so, yes." Something flickered across the old woman's face, there and gone, so quickly Elena almost missed it. "Did she now?" Lady Beatrice murmured, more to herself than to Elena. "Well, my nephew must have his reasons." Is there something wrong with the room? Elena asked. Lady Beatrice's eyes met hers, and for a moment the sharpness in them softened into something that looked almost like pity. Nothing is wrong with the room, child. It is only that some rooms remember more than others. She waved a thin hand before Elena could ask what she meant. Never mind an old woman's fancies. Fetch my shawl. It is cold this morning, and getting colder. Elena spent the rest of the day learning the rhythms of the house, the hours Lady Beatrice liked her tea, the names of the servants, the long silences that fell over every room whenever a particular subject seemed near. She noticed, too, how often conversations died the moment she entered them, how the younger maids exchanged glances when her chamber was mentioned, how even the sturdy old butler, Mr. Godfrey, seemed to walk faster past the door at the end of the west corridor. It was late afternoon when she finally saw the Duke. She was crossing the great hall, her arms full of linens Mrs. Bellamy had asked her to carry, when a tall figure emerged from the library, and she nearly walked into him. He was younger than she had expected, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with the same pale ashwood eyes she had seen in the portraits, though his held none of their painted arrogance. His held something closer to exhaustion. "You must be the new companion," he said, his voice low and controlled, the voice of a man used to measuring every word before he let it leave his mouth. "Elena Whitmore, Your Grace." She dropped a small curtsy, awkward with the linen still in her arms. He studied her for a long moment, longer than politeness required, and Elena felt the strange sensation of being examined for something he expected to find, and could not. "I trust your room is comfortable," he said at last. "Very comfortable, Your Grace, though I confess, I was told it belonged to the old Duke." His jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, a small crack in an otherwise perfect stillness. "It did," he said. "That is all you need know of it. I would ask you not to trouble the staff with questions about that room, Miss Whitmore. Some subjects in this house are not open for discussion." "I meant no offense, Your Grace." "None taken." He inclined his head, the barest courtesy, and turned to go, then paused, as though something had caught in him and would not release its hold. "One more thing," he said, without turning back. "Do not go into the locked door within the chamber. It leads nowhere you need to be." Elena blinked. "I did not know there was a locked door, Your Grace." For the first time, he turned fully around, and something in his pale eyes sharpened into a kind of wariness she had not expected from a duke addressing a servant. "Then now you do," he said. "Good night, Miss Whitmore." And he walked away down the corridor, his footsteps echoing off the stone, until the house swallowed the sound entirely, leaving Elena standing alone in the great hall, with her arms full of linens, and her mind full of questions that no one in this house seemed willing to answer, and a growing certainty, cold and quiet as the wind outside, that she had been given far more than a room. She had been given a secret, and it was already beginning to open its eyes. That night, Elena searched her chamber by candlelight after everyone else had gone to bed. She ran her hands along the paneled walls until, behind a heavy wardrobe she had to push with all her strength, she found it. A second door, small and plain, painted the same color as the wall so that it nearly vanished into it, its handle bound shut with a thin chain and an old iron lock. She pressed her ear against the wood and heard nothing but the settling creak of an old house breathing in the cold. Still, she did not try the lock. Not that night. She only stood there for a long while, her candle throwing a small, trembling circle of light against a door that someone had gone to great trouble to hide, in a room no woman had slept in for 6 years, in a house that flinched every time she asked a simple question, and she understood, with a certainty that settled deep into her bones, that Ashcombe Hall was not going to let her leave until she knew why. Sleep did not come easily after that, and when it finally did, it was thin and restless, broken again and again by sounds Elena could not place. On the third night in the west chamber, she woke to the certainty that someone was standing just outside her door. She lay still, her heart hammering, listening to the faint scrape of a foot against stone, the soft, careful weight of someone trying very hard not to be heard. When she finally found the courage to rise and pull the door open, the corridor stretched empty in both directions, lit only by the low gutter of a single candle in its sconce, and yet the air held the faint, unmistakable trace of someone who had only just left. She did not tell Lady Beatrice. She did not tell Mrs. Bellamy. She told no one, because she had already learned, in her short time at Ashcombe Hall, that questions here were met with closed faces and closed doors, and she had decided, quietly and firmly, that if no one would give her answers, she would find them herself. The chance came 4 days later, when a young housemaid named Ivy brought up her morning tea, her hands trembling so badly that the cup rattled against its saucer. "You mustn't mind me," Ivy said quickly, setting the tray down. "I don't like this room is all. Never have." "Why not?" Elena asked, keeping her voice gentle, unhurried, the voice she had learned to use on frightened animals as a girl. Ivy glanced at the door, as though it might be listening. "Because of what happened to the last woman who slept here," she whispered. "Before you." Before the room stood empty, there was a lady's maid who tended this chamber, went by the name of Margaret. She wasn't a guest, mind. She served the old Duke's household, back when his son, the one who should have inherited, was still alive. Ivy's voice dropped even lower. One night, Margaret simply wasn't there anymore. No note, no goodbye, nothing packed. Her shawl was still hanging on the back of that very chair when they found the room empty. She was never seen again, not in this county nor any other, far as anyone ever heard. Elena felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the draft beneath the window. Did no one search for her? They did, for a time, but the old Duke's household was already in mourning that year. His eldest son, the true heir, had died only weeks before, fallen from his horse on the North Road, they said though. Ivy stopped herself, pressing her lips together as though she had said too much. "Though what, Ivy?" "Nothing, miss. I've said too much already. Mrs. Bellamy will have my position if she hears I've been talking." Ivy hurried from the room without another word, leaving the tea to go cold on the tray, and Elena alone, with a single new thread pulled loose from a story someone in this house had worked very hard to bury. She thought of the empty portrait frame in the great hall, turned to face the wall. She thought of the Duke's warning about the locked door. She thought of the old Duke's son, the true heir, dead before his time, and a maid named Margaret who had vanished in the very room where Elena now slept each night, and she understood that these two disappearances were not separate stories at all. They were the same story, wearing two different faces. That evening, she found Lady Beatrice alone in the small drawing room, working at a piece of needlework her failing eyes could no longer truly manage, and Elena sat across from her, and, choosing her words with care, said, "My lady, may I ask you about the old Duke's son, the eldest?" The needle stopped. Lady Beatrice did not look up. "Who has been talking to you?" "No one, my lady. I only wondered, since I understand my chamber once belonged to him." "It did not belong to him," Lady Beatrice said sharply, and then, seeming to hear the sharpness in her own voice, softened, though her hands still trembled around the needlework. "It belonged to his father, the old Duke, but it is true that Julian slept there often, in his final years, when his father's health began to fail, and he took on more of the household's affairs." Her voice grew distant, drifting somewhere Elena could not follow. "He was a fine boy, warm, where his brother is cold, quick to laugh, where his brother has forgotten how. He would have made a very different Duke than the one we have now. What happened to him, my lady?" Lady Beatrice's eyes finally lifted, and in them, Elena saw something she had not expected to find in this house of guarded faces. Grief, raw and unhealed, 6 years old and still bleeding. They say he fell from his horse on the North Road, in a storm, and struck his head upon a stone. They found him the next morning, past saving. Her hands closed tightly around the needlework. "I have never believed it. Julian rode that road since he was a boy. He knew every stone in it. He would not have fallen. Not there. Not that night of all nights." "Why that night, my lady?" "Because that was the same night his father's lady's maid disappeared," Lady Beatrice said, so quietly, Elena had to lean forward to catch the words. "Margaret. A sweet girl. Too sweet for the company she kept, perhaps." She shook her head, as though trying to shake the memory loose from wherever it had lodged. "I have said enough. More than enough. If my nephew learns I have spoken of this, he will be most displeased, and displeased is a mild word for what he becomes when that subject arises. Why does it trouble him so deeply, if it was his brother and not himself?" Lady Beatrice's eyes, when they met Elena's again, held something close to warning. "Because he was the one who found them, child, both of them, Julian's body upon the road, and Margaret's empty room, on the very same morning." A man does not walk away from a discovery like that unchanged. Now, I have said quite enough for one evening, and my eyes ache. Ring for my maid, would you? I find I am very tired. Elena did as she was asked, but the words followed her back up the stairs, into the west chamber, where the fire had burned low, and the shadows had grown long across the floor. She stood before the hidden door behind the wardrobe for a long while that night, her candle trembling slightly in her hand, and though she still did not try the lock, she understood now that whatever waited behind it had claimed at least 2 lives already, and that the Duke's warning had not been the command of a careless master. It had been the plea of a man trying, in the only way he knew, to keep her from walking into the same dark that had swallowed his brother and the woman his brother had perhaps loved. She thought of the Duke's face when he had spoken of the room, the crack in his stillness, quickly hidden. She had taken him, at first meeting, for a cold man, distant and hard, the kind of master who ruled his house through silence and expectation rather than kindness. But she began to wonder, lying awake in that borrowed bed, whether the coldness was not cruelty at all, but armor, worn so long over an old wound that he had forgotten there was a man still living underneath it. 2 nights later, unable to sleep, Elena rose and walked the corridors of the sleeping house, telling herself she only wished to fetch a book from the library, though in truth she wished to see, in the dark and the quiet, whether the house would show her anything it kept hidden by day. She passed the great hall, the empty portrait frame catching the last dying light of the banked fire, and she paused before it, struck by a sudden, foolish urge. She turned it around. The canvas beneath was of a young man, dark-haired like the Duke, but with none of his brother's guarded stillness, painted mid-laugh, his pale ashwood eyes bright with a warmth that seemed to leap from the paint itself. Beneath the frame's edge, a small brass plate read simply, "Julian, beloved son and brother." You were not meant to see that. Elena spun around, her candle nearly slipping from her hand. The Duke stood a few feet away in the shadow of the stairway, still dressed, as though he too had not found his way to sleep. His pale eyes moved from her face to the painting and back again, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "I'm sorry, Your Grace," Elena said. "I did not mean to intrude." "No," he said slowly. "I do not suppose you did." He stepped closer, until the candlelight caught the tired lines beneath his eyes, lines she had not noticed before, and he looked at his brother's painted face, the way a man looks at a wound he has never let close. "I turned it around myself, the week after we buried him. I could not bear to walk past his face every morning, and know I would never hear his laugh again." His voice, when it came, had lost every trace of the coldness she had grown used to. "I did not expect anyone in this house to ever ask about him again. Everyone has learned, over the years, that it is easier not to." "Lady Beatrice told me a little," Elena admitted, seeing no purpose left in pretending otherwise. "About Julian, and about Margaret." Something passed across his face, quick and sharp as a struck match. "Then you know more than most who live under this roof." He turned the portrait back to face the wall himself, his hand lingering a moment too long against the frame. "I would ask you, Miss Whitmore, to leave the rest of it alone. Not because I do not trust you, because I do not yet know what would happen, if the truth of that night were finally dragged into the light, and I have already lost one person I loved, to the darkness it left behind. I find I am not prepared to lose anyone else to it." He looked at her then, really looked, in a way that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. "Good night, Miss Whitmore. Please, go back to your room, and lock your door, and do not open the one behind your wardrobe. Not yet. Not until I am certain it is safe for you to know what waits on the other side of it." He left her standing alone in the great hall, the fire guttering low, the empty frame once more turned to the wall, and Elena understood, walking back to her chamber through corridors that suddenly felt far less empty than before, that the Duke was not trying to keep a secret from her. He was trying, however clumsily, however coldly, to protect her from one, and that single realization frightened her far more than any locked door ever could. The days that followed settled into a strange and careful rhythm. By morning, the Duke was as distant and formal as he had ever been, addressing Elena only when necessary, his pale eyes sliding past her in the corridors, as though the conversation in the great hall had never happened. But Elena had seen the man beneath the armor now, and she could no longer unsee him, and she found herself watching for the small cracks, the moments when his composure slipped, the way his gaze lingered on the west corridor door when he thought no one was looking. It was Ivy, in the end, who gave her the next piece of the puzzle, though she did not mean to. Elena had asked, gently, careful not to frighten the girl again, whether the room had always looked as it did now, or whether anything had been changed since Julian's time. Ivy had hesitated, glanced toward the door as she always did, and then said, "There's a loose panel, miss, behind the headboard. Old Godfrey mentioned it once, years back, before he learned to keep his mouth shut about this room like the rest of us. Said the wood was never properly fitted after some repair or other." That night, once the house had gone quiet, Elena moved the heavy bed away from the wall, inch by careful inch, her arms aching with the effort, until she found it. A panel that did not sit quite flush with the others, its edge catching the candlelight at a slightly different angle. She pressed her fingers against it, and with a soft groan of old wood, it shifted, revealing a narrow gap behind the paneling, and within that gap, wrapped in a square of yellowed cloth, a small leather-bound book. Her hands trembled as she drew it out. The leather was cracked with age, the pages soft and foxed at the edges, and on the inside cover, in a careful, feminine hand, was written a single name, Margaret Hale. Elena sat on the edge of the bed for a long while before she found the courage to open it, aware that she was about to read words meant for no one's eyes but the woman who had written them, a woman who had vanished from this very room and never been seen again. But she thought of the empty portrait, of the Duke's grief-worn face, of Lady Beatrice's trembling hands around her needlework, and she understood that some silences had already done enough damage. She opened the diary and began to read. The early entries were unremarkable, the small daily concerns of a lady's maid in a great house, complaints about the cold, small triumphs over difficult mending, gentle observations about the family she served. But as the pages turned, a new name began to appear again and again, at first mentioned only in passing, then with increasing warmth, until it filled entire pages on its own. "Julian came to the kitchen garden again today," one entry read. "He says I have no business calling myself only a maid when I read faster than his own tutor ever could. I told him a maid's position does not change simply because a duke's son enjoys her company. He only laughed and told me positions were made by men, and men could unmake them just as easily, if they had the courage." Further pages spoke of secret meetings in the orangery, of books passed hand to hand and returned with notes tucked between the pages, of a friendship that had deepened, entry by entry, into something neither of them, it seemed, had been prepared for. Elena read late into the night, the candle burning lower and lower, until she reached an entry near the diary's final pages that made her breath catch in her throat.
"He has asked me to marry him. I told him it was impossible, that his father would never allow it, that the whole county would call him a fool, and me worse."
He said he did not care what the county called him, that he had loved me since the summer I first came to Ashcombe, and that he intended to marry me whether his father blessed it or not. We are to be wed quietly, in secret, at the little chapel 2 villages over, before anyone in this house can stop us. I am frightened. I am also, for the first time in my life, entirely happy. The next entry, dated only 3 days later, was shorter, and the careful hand had begun to shake. "Someone knows. I do not know who, but Julian says his cousin has been asking strange questions, and there is a coldness in this house tonight that I do not like. Julian says we must move our plans forward, that we cannot wait for the date we chose. He says we will leave before the week is out and marry as soon as we are safely away. I am packing what little I dare to pack without drawing notice. I pray we are not too late." There were no more entries after that. The remaining pages were blank, save for a single loose sheet tucked into the very back of the book, the handwriting on it hurried and uneven, so unlike the careful script of the earlier pages that Elena had to read it twice to be certain it was Margaret's hand at all. "If anyone finds this, know that I did not run away. Julian did not fall from his horse by accident. His cousin Roderick came to me tonight and told me plainly that if I did not leave Ashcombe forever and never speak Julian's name again, I would share whatever fate had befallen him. I do not yet know what that fate is, only that Julian did not come to meet me as we planned, and my heart tells me something terrible has happened, and I am too afraid to ask the questions that would confirm it. I am leaving this diary hidden, because I do not trust myself to carry it safely, and because I want someone, someday, to know that I loved him honestly, and that whatever becomes of me now was not my choosing. Elena sat very still for a long time after she finished reading, the candle guttering beside her, the diary open in her lap, and the name Roderick echoing in her mind like a struck bell. She had heard the name only once before, in passing, from Mrs. Bellamy, who had mentioned a distant cousin who managed some of the estate's northern properties and rarely visited the main house. A man Elena had never met, and yet a man whose name now sat at the very center of everything this house had spent 6 years trying to forget. She did not sleep at all that night. By the time the first gray light crept through the curtains, she had made her decision. She would not go to Lady Beatrice, whose health was too frail to bear such a shock, nor to Mrs. Bellamy, who plainly already knew more than she would ever say. She would go to the one person in this house who had spent 6 years carrying this grief alone, believing perhaps that he alone knew the shape of it. She found the Duke in the library that morning, standing before the tall windows with a letter in his hand that he did not seem to be reading. He turned when she entered, and something in her face must have told him at once that whatever she had come to say was not the idle conversation of a companion looking to fill her morning. "Miss Whitmore," he said carefully, "you look as though you have not slept." "I found something, Your Grace," Elena said, and drew the diary from beneath her shawl, holding it out to him, with hands that would not quite stop trembling, behind a loose panel in my chamber. "I believe you should read it before I say anything more." He looked at the small leather book for a long moment without moving, and when he finally reached for it, his hand was not entirely steady either. He opened it to the first page, saw the name written there, and went very still, the color draining slowly from his face. "Margaret's diary," he said quietly. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Grace." He read in silence, for what felt like a very long time, standing exactly where he was, the letter in his other hand forgotten, and slipping unnoticed to the floor. Elena watched his face as he turned each page, watched the careful stillness he wore, like a second skin begin, at last, to crack open. Grief, and something sharper, something closer to fury, moving beneath it, like water beneath thin ice. When he reached the final loose sheet, the one written in haste and fear, his hand closed around the paper so tightly that Elena feared he might tear it. "Roderick," he said, and his voice, when it came, was low and terrible, stripped of every trace of the cold composure she had grown used to. "My own cousin." He looked up at her, and in his pale eyes Elena saw 6 years of unanswered grief, finally finding a name to attach itself to, a shape it could finally, after so long in the dark, begin to fight. "I searched for her, Miss Whitmore. After Julian died, after Margaret disappeared, I searched every road, every village, every port within 50 miles. I told myself she had simply fled a house, full of grief she had no wish to share in, that she had chosen to disappear rather than face a world without him. I never once suspected that someone in my own family had frightened her into silence, or worse." His jaw tightened, and for the first time since she had arrived at Ashcombe Hall, Elena saw something other than grief in his face. She saw resolve, cold and clear and absolute. "Roderick manages the northern estates. He has not set foot in this house in 3 years, by his own choosing, and I confess, I never once questioned why a man so eager for my company in his youth had grown so content to stay away from it since my brother's death." He closed the diary carefully, almost reverently, and held it against his chest, as though it were something far more fragile than old leather and paper. "Thank you, Miss Whitmore. You have given me, in one morning, more truth than I found in 6 years of searching. But I must ask you now, and I ask it in earnest, not as a command, but as a plea. Say nothing of this to anyone in this house, not to Mrs. Bellamy, not to my aunt, not to a single servant, however trusted you believe them to be. If Roderick learns that his secret has surfaced, after 6 years of believing it buried forever, I do not know what a man capable of what this diary describes might do to protect it a second time." "I understand, Your Grace," Elena said, "but what will you do now?" He looked down at the diary in his hands, and when he answered, his voice carried a weight she had not heard in it before, the weight of a decision 6 years in the making, finally, taking shape. "Now," he said, "I am going to finish what I should have done the morning I found my brother's body, and could not bring myself to believe that anyone I called family could be capable of such a thing. I am going to find out exactly what happened to Julian, and to Margaret, and I am going to make certain that whoever is responsible answers for it, whatever the cost to this family's name." He met her eyes, and something passed between them that felt, for the first time since Elena had arrived beneath this roof, less like a stranger's caution, and more like the beginning of trust. "And I would very much like your help in doing it, Miss Whitmore, if you are willing to give it." "I am, Your Grace," Elena said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it entirely. They began carefully, the way one begins to pull at a single thread, without unraveling the whole cloth too quickly, and warning the hand that had woven it. The Duke, whose name Elena had by now learned was Nathaniel, though she still called him Your Grace in front of the staff, sent quiet inquiries north, under the guise of routine estate business, asking after the accounts Roderick kept for the northern properties, requesting ledgers that had not been reviewed in years. He told no one the true purpose behind the requests, not even Mr. Godfrey, whose loyalty he trusted, but whose discretion, in matters this dangerous, he was no longer willing to test. Elena, for her part, returned to the small chapel mentioned in Margaret's diary, using the excuse of accompanying Lady Beatrice on her Sunday visits to the parish, where the elderly rector, a gentleman with a long memory, remembered the arrangements for a quiet wedding 6 years past that had never taken place. "A young couple came to me that spring," he told Elena, when she asked, phrasing her questions as idle curiosity about the old records. "Wished to be married without banns read, in secret, which I do not favor, but the young man was persuasive, and generous besides. I set a date. They never came. I assumed they had thought better of it, or that the young man's family had discovered the plan and forbidden it. It was not so uncommon a thing, in those days, for such arrangements to fall apart before the day arrived." "Do you recall the young man's name?" Elena asked, already certain of the answer. "I do," the rector said, "because I recognized him. Julian Ashwood, the old Duke's eldest son, a fine young man. I was sorry, later, to hear of his death. I confess I never connected the two events in my mind until this very moment, though now that you ask, I find I cannot understand why I did not." It was a small confirmation, but it was confirmation nonetheless, and Elena carried it back to Ashcombe Hall like a stone in her pocket, heavy with meaning. When she relayed it to Nathaniel that evening, in the library, with the door locked and the curtains drawn against any curious eyes, his face grew harder still. "Then, it is as the diary says," he murmured. "They meant to marry, and someone stopped them before the wedding could take place. And 3 days after Margaret wrote of her fear, Julian was dead, and she was gone." He paced the length of the library, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "I need more than a rector's memory and a dead woman's diary, Elena. I need proof that will stand before a magistrate, proof that cannot be dismissed as an old grudge between cousins, or the fanciful imaginings of a grieving brother. Roderick has had 6 years to cover his tracks. I doubt he has left them carelessly exposed." It was the first time he had called her Elena, and though the moment passed almost too quickly for either of them to acknowledge it, she noticed, and something in her chest turned over gently at the sound of her own name in his voice. The ledgers, when they finally arrived from the northern estates 2 weeks later, told their own quiet story, if one knew how to read between the careful columns of figures. A payment, unusually large, made to a firm of solicitors in a distant port town, dated only 4 days after Julian's death. A second payment, smaller but recurring, made quarterly for the first 2 years following, then abruptly ceasing. Nathaniel studied the entries for hours, his frustration mounting with every column that raised more questions than it answered. "Passage money," he said finally, tapping the page. "And afterward, payment for silence, I would guess, though to whom, the ledger does not say." He looked up at Elena, who sat across the desk from him, her own eyes tired from hours spent cross-referencing dates against the diary's final entries. If Roderick paid for Margaret's passage somewhere, and paid again afterward to keep her silent, then she may still be alive, Elena, wherever he sent her. The thought had not occurred to Elena until that moment, and it struck her with a force that left her breathless. She had assumed, as the household clearly assumed, as even Lady Beatrice's grief seemed to assume, that Margaret's disappearance had ended the same way Julian's life had. But the ledger told a different, stranger story, one of exile rather than murder, of a woman frightened into silence and paid to stay away rather than silenced permanently. "We must find the solicitors," Elena said. "If they arranged her passage, they will know where she went." It took another week of careful, discreet correspondence. Letters written under invented pretenses. A small bribe, paid through an intermediary, Nathaniel trusted from his years at university, before the answer finally came. Margaret Hale had taken passage, 6 years past, to a small coastal town in the west of Ireland, traveling under a different name, and had, according to the solicitor's final record of the matter, settled there and never once inquired after news from Ashcombe Hall, nor sent word to anyone within it. "She is alive," Nathaniel said, reading the letter over 3 times, as though the words might change if he looked at them long enough. "Elena, she is alive." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. 6 years of grief, finally finding, in that single confirmation, the first real crack of light it had seen since the morning he found his brother's body upon the North Road. "Then we must go to her," Elena said. "She is the only person left living who knows exactly what happened that night. Roderick may have taken from her the man she loved, but he did not take her memory of what he did to secure it." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, softened, opened in a way she had not seen since that first strange conversation in the great hall beneath his brother's turned portrait. "You would come with me," he said, not quite a question. "I would," Elena said simply. "I did not come to this house merely to keep your aunt company. Your Grace, however much I have come to care for her, I came, it seems, to help set right something that has been wrong for 6 years. I do not intend to stop now, when we are finally close enough to see the truth clearly." "Nathaniel," he said quietly, "if we are to travel together in search of the truth, I think you might call me Nathaniel, at least when we are not within hearing of the staff." "Nathaniel," Elena repeated, and found that the name settled comfortably in her mouth, as though it had always belonged there. They left 3 days later, telling Lady Beatrice and the household only that the Duke had urgent business regarding the northern estates that required his personal attention, and that Miss Whitmore would accompany him as far as the coast, to visit a distant relation of her own, a small lie that sat uneasily with Elena, but felt necessary all the same. Mrs. Bellamy watched them go with an expression Elena could not quite read, somewhere between suspicion and cautious hope, as though the housekeeper had waited 6 years for someone, anyone, to finally disturb the silence that had settled so heavily over Ashcombe Hall. The journey west was long and difficult, 3 days of rough roads and rougher weather, but Elena found she did not mind it half so much as she might have expected, not with Nathaniel beside her, his cold formality worn thinner with every mile that carried them closer to answers he had waited 6 years to find. He spoke, during those long hours in the carriage, of his brother, memories he had clearly kept locked away as tightly as the diary behind the wardrobe panel, small stories of childhood mischief and shared secrets, and Elena listened, and understood that the man beside her was slowly, carefully, allowing himself to grieve properly for the first time since the loss had happened, no longer alone with it, no longer forced to carry it in silence behind a duke's cold composure. "I used to think," he told her, somewhere on the second night, as they sat before a small fire in a country inn, the rest of the household long asleep, that if I simply did not speak of him, the pain would eventually grow smaller. It never did. It only grew quieter, and quiet pain, I have learned, is far more dangerous than loud grief, because no one thinks to ask if you are still carrying it." "You are not carrying it alone anymore," Elena said, and reached across the small space between them to take his hand, an act of comfort more than courtship, though she felt, in the warmth of his fingers closing around hers, that the line between the two had perhaps already begun, quietly, and without either of their permission, to blur. They reached the small coastal town on the 4th day, weathered and travel-worn, and began, with careful, discreet inquiries at the local church and market, the search for a woman who had spent 6 years trying very hard not to be found. The town was small enough that a stranger's face drew notice within a day, and by the second afternoon, a fishwife at the market, upon hearing Elena describe a woman of Margaret's age and coloring who might have arrived some 6 years past under an assumed name, pointed them toward a small whitewashed cottage at the edge of the harbor, set apart from its neighbors by a low stone wall, and a garden kept with more care than most in that hard, salt-worn town. Nathaniel stood before the gate for a long moment without moving, and Elena understood, watching him, that 6 years of grief and hope and fear had gathered themselves into this single moment, and that whatever waited behind that door, might either heal something in him or break it further, and there was no way to know which until the door was opened. It was Elena who finally knocked, since a stranger's face might frighten less than a duke's, and after a long pause, the door opened on a woman who might have been beautiful once, in an untroubled life, but whose face now carried the particular weariness of someone who had spent years waiting for a knock she both hoped for and dreaded. "Margaret Hale," Elena said gently, and watched the woman's face drain of all color. "That is not my name," Margaret said, already beginning to close the door. "You have the wrong house." "Please," Elena said quickly. "We have not come to harm you. We have come because of Julian." The door stopped, halfway shut, and through the narrow gap Elena saw Margaret's eyes fill with a mixture of terror and something else, something that looked almost like 6 years of held breath finally, cautiously, beginning to release. "Julian is dead," Margaret whispered. "I know," Nathaniel said, stepping forward from where he had waited by the gate, and at the sound of his voice, Margaret's eyes widened further, recognition and fresh grief crossing her face at once. "I am his brother, Margaret. I have come to ask you what truly happened that night, because I believe someone in my own family arranged his death and frightened you into exile to keep the truth from ever surfacing." For a long moment, Margaret said nothing at all, simply stood in the doorway of the small cottage she had built for herself out of grief and fear, staring at the face of the man who so closely resembled the one she had loved and lost, and then, slowly, she opened the door fully and stepped aside to let them in. "I have waited 6 years for someone to come and ask me that question," she said, her voice trembling. "I had begun to believe no one ever would." Inside, over tea, neither of them truly tasted. Margaret told them everything, the story spilling out of her in a rush, after 6 long years of silence, as though the words had been straining against a dam that had finally, mercifully, broken. She spoke of her love for Julian, careful and quiet at first, then bold enough to risk everything for a secret marriage neither of them regretted planning. She spoke of Roderick's visit, 3 nights before the wedding was meant to take place, his voice pleasant on the surface, but carrying beneath it a threat she had understood immediately and completely. "He told me Julian's father would never accept a lady's maid as a daughter, and that if the marriage went forward, Julian would be disinherited entirely, cast out, ruined, and I would have ruined him along with myself," Margaret said, her hands wrapped tightly around her teacup, as though it were the only solid thing in the room. "I did not believe he meant to do worse than that, not at first. I thought it was only cruelty. The kind cousins sometimes show one another. Jealousy, dressed up as concern for the family name." Her voice broke. "I did not learn the truth of it until it was already far too late to save him." "What happened that night?" Nathaniel asked, his voice carefully steady, though Elena, seated beside him, could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a fire. "Julian came to my room to tell me our plans had changed, that we would leave 2 nights earlier than we'd agreed, before Roderick could interfere further," Margaret said. "He left to arrange the horses himself, rather than trust a groom who might carry word to his father. I never saw him alive again." She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth for a moment before continuing. "Roderick came to me instead, before dawn, and told me Julian had suffered a terrible accident on the North Road. He said if I ever spoke of our plans, of the marriage, of anything at all, he would ensure I was blamed for Julian's death, that it would be said I had lured a duke's son into a reckless midnight ride for my own advantage, and that no one would ever believe a lady's maid's word against a gentleman's. He gave me money for passage and told me to disappear and never return, and God forgive me, I was so frightened and so broken by grief that I did exactly as he said." "You believe he arranged Julian's death," Nathaniel said quietly. "It was not a question." "I have believed it for 6 years," Margaret said. "Julian knew that road better than any man alive. He would not have fallen from a well-trained horse on a stretch of ground he had ridden 1,000 times before, not without cause. I have always believed Roderick did something to that road, or to the horse, though I have no proof beyond my own certainty, and a certainty is not evidence a magistrate would ever accept from a runaway maid with every reason, in the world's eyes, to want revenge upon the family that cast her out." Nathaniel was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight, his hands clenched upon his knees. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet, controlled fury that Elena had not heard from him before, not even in the library the day the diary had first revealed Roderick's name. "You have given me more than certainty, Margaret," he said. "You have given me a witness willing to speak, and a motive, and a pattern of payments that a solicitor in this very town can confirm came directly from Roderick's hand. It will not be easy, and it will not be quick, but I intend to see him answer for what he did to my brother, and to you, before a proper court, and I would be deeply grateful if you would be willing to return with us and give testimony to that effect, once we have gathered enough to ensure you are protected rather than blamed." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, the first she had allowed herself in front of them. 6 years of fear finally finding an outlet in something that looked almost like hope. "I have spent 6 years believing I would carry this alone forever," she said. "I never dared to dream that someone might come looking for the truth, let alone believe me when I told it." She looked at Nathaniel then, really looked at him, and Elena saw the resemblance to Julian she must have been seeing all along, painful and precious at once. "He loved you very much, you know. He spoke of you often, even in our last days together. He worried you carried too much weight upon your shoulders, even then, before any of this happened. I think he would be glad to know you finally set some of it down long enough to come looking for the truth on his behalf." They stayed in the small coastal town 3 more days, gathering what statements and records they could. The solicitor who had arranged Margaret's passage confirming, under careful and lawful pressure, that the funds had come from Roderick Vane's own accounts, marked in his private ledgers, as payment for matters requiring discretion. It was not, on its own, an admission of murder, but combined with Margaret's testimony and the timing so carefully laid out in her diary, it was enough, Nathaniel believed, to bring the matter properly before a magistrate, and enough, more importantly to Elena, to finally begin loosening the 6 years of guilt and grief that had settled so heavily over Ashcombe Hall and everyone who lived beneath its roof. On their last evening in the coastal town, walking along the harbor as the sun set the water on fire with orange and gold, Nathaniel stopped and turned to Elena, his pale eyes catching the last of the light. "I came to Ashcombe 6 years ago, never expecting to inherit a title I did not want, carrying a grief I did not know how to hold," he said quietly. "I built walls around myself, because I did not trust anyone enough to let them see how deeply that loss had cut me. And then a young woman with more courage than sense was given my brother's old room, and instead of leaving well enough alone, as any sensible person would have done, she pulled at every thread until the whole truth finally came undone." He reached for her hand, gently, as though asking permission with the gesture itself. "I do not know how to thank you properly for what you have given me these past weeks, Elena. I only know that I do not wish this to be the end of whatever has grown between us on this journey." "It is not the end," Elena said softly, her fingers curling around his. "I rather think it is only the beginning, Nathaniel. We still have a very great deal of truth left to bring home." He smiled then, a real smile, the first she had seen from him since her arrival at Ashcombe Hall, and for a moment, standing together at the edge of the sea with the truth finally within reach, the weight of 6 years seemed, if not entirely lifted, then at least, for the first time, bearable enough to carry together. The journey back to Ashcombe Hall felt shorter than the journey away from it, though the roads were no less rough and the weather no kinder, because this time, Elena traveled beside a man who no longer carried his grief in silence, and Margaret rode with them, pale and anxious but resolute, ready at last to speak the truth she had swallowed for 6 long years. They did not announce their return, nor their purpose, arriving at Ashcombe Hall in the grey hour just after dawn, when the household was only beginning to stir. Mrs. Bellamy met them at the door, her sharp eyes moving from Nathaniel's face to Elena's, to the unfamiliar woman standing between them, and something in her expression shifted, a held breath finally released, as though some part of her had been waiting 6 years for exactly this moment to arrive. "You found her," Mrs. Bellamy said quietly, not a question at all. "You knew," Nathaniel said, studying his housekeeper's face with new understanding. "You knew there was more to it than a simple accident and a runaway maid." "I suspected," Mrs. Bellamy admitted. "I never had proof, and I was never fool enough to accuse a member of this family without it, not while I still had a position and a livelihood to protect. But I have watched Mr. Roderick's face at every family gathering these past 6 years, Your Grace, and I have never once seen a man who looked less like someone mourning a beloved cousin, and more like a man who feared discovery." She stepped aside to let them enter. "What will you do now?" "Send for a magistrate," Nathaniel said. and send word to Roderick that his presence is required at Ashcombe Hall on a matter of urgent estate business. I do not intend to give him time to prepare a defense, nor time to disappear the way he made Margaret disappear 6 years ago. It took 3 days to arrange properly, 3 days in which Nathaniel worked with a magistrate from the county seat, a careful, methodical man who reviewed the diary, the ledgers, and Margaret's sworn statement with the gravity such evidence deserved, and who agreed, in the end, that there was sufficient cause to question Roderick Vane formally regarding the deaths and disappearances connected to Ashcombe Hall 6 years past. Roderick arrived on the third evening, summoned under the pretense of discussing the Northern estate accounts, and Elena watched from the shadow of the great hall as he strode through the doors with the easy confidence of a man who had spent 6 years believing himself entirely safe. He was older than Julian's portrait had suggested, with a thin, calculating face and eyes that moved quickly over every corner of the hall, as though counting what still remained his to eventually inherit. "Nathaniel," Roderick said warmly, extending a hand his cousin did not take. "You look well. It has been too long since I last visited the main house." "It has," Nathaniel agreed, his voice carrying a cold formality Elena recognized now not as his natural state, but as the armor he had once worn every day of his life, brought out now for a purpose far more deliberate than habit. "Come into the library, cousin. There is a matter I wish to discuss with you, regarding the Northern accounts, and regarding an old debt that I believe has finally come due." Roderick's easy smile did not falter as he followed his cousin into the library, but Elena, watching closely, saw the first flicker of unease cross his face when he noticed the magistrate seated quietly near the window, a stack of documents arranged neatly upon the desk before him. What followed was not the dramatic confrontation Elena had half expected, no shouted confessions, no desperate flight into the night. Instead, it was worse, in its way, a slow and methodical dismantling of 6 years of careful lies, laid out one piece at a time, before a man who had believed himself untouchable. The diary, the ledgers, the solicitor's records, and finally, when Roderick's protests had grown thin and his composure had begun, at last, to crack, Margaret herself, stepping into the room from where she had waited in the corridor, her chin lifted, despite the fear Elena could see trembling, just beneath her calm surface. "You told me you would ruin me if I ever spoke," Margaret said, her voice steady despite everything it cost her to make it so. "You were wrong, Mr. Vane. It was never my silence that was going to save you. It was only ever borrowed time." Roderick's face, when he finally understood there was no argument left that could save him, no lie clever enough to explain away 6 years of carefully hidden guilt, crumbled into something that looked almost pitiful, the confidence draining out of him until he seemed, for the first time, like exactly what he was, a small and frightened man who had let jealousy and ambition cost 2 innocent people everything they had ever hoped for. He did not confess outright, not fully, not that night, clinging instead to half-denials and desperate reframing, insisting he had never intended for Julian to be seriously harmed, that he had only meant to frighten him, that the fall had truly been an accident, born from a confrontation gone wrong, rather than deliberate murder. But it was enough, combined with everything else laid before the magistrate, to see him taken into custody that very evening, to answer before a proper court for what 6 years of silence had allowed him to escape. Ashcombe Hall was quiet in the days that followed, but it was a different quiet than the one Elena had first encountered on her arrival, no longer the heavy, watchful silence of secrets carefully guarded, but something closer to the hush that follows a long illness finally broken, exhausted but hopeful, ready at last to begin healing properly. Lady Beatrice wept, when finally told the truth, tears she had clearly been holding back for 6 long years, grief, for Julian, mixing with a fierce, righteous anger at the cousin who had stolen him from them. "I always knew," she said, gripping Elena's hand tightly. "In my heart, I always knew it could not have been a simple accident. Thank you, child, for finally proving my heart was right to doubt it." The empty portrait frame in the great hall was turned to face outward once more, Julian's warm, laughing face, restored to its rightful place among the generations of Ashwood ancestors who had come before him. No longer a wound too painful to look upon, but a memory finally allowed to be honored properly, in the light, rather than hidden away in shadow and silence. Margaret stayed at Ashcombe Hall through the trial that followed, giving her testimony before the court with a steadiness that surprised even herself, And when Roderick was finally convicted and sentenced for his role in Julian's death, and the 6 years of extortion and exile that followed, she wept not with grief alone, but with something that finally, after so long, resembled peace. "I do not know what comes next for me," Margaret admitted to Elena, on the evening after the verdict was announced, the two women sitting together in the small drawing room, where Elena had once listened to Lady Beatrice's careful, grieving memories of a son she had lost twice over, once to death, and once to silence. "I have spent 6 years building a life around hiding. I hardly know how to build one around simply living, without fear standing over every choice I make." "You have time now," Elena said gently. "That is the one thing his silence could never have given you, and the one thing your courage has finally won back." Margaret smiled, small and tired but real, and reached for Elena's hand. "Thank you," she said, "for knocking on my door when you had every reason in the world to leave well enough alone." As for Elena herself, the West Chamber no longer held the same shadowed weight it once had. She had moved, at Lady Beatrice's gentle insistence, to a brighter room in the eastern wing, but she found herself, some evenings, still returning to the old chamber, simply to sit for a while by the fire, no longer haunted by what the room had witnessed, but quietly grateful for the secret it had finally, after 6 years, allowed her to uncover. Winter settled over Ashcombe Hall in the months that followed, but it did not carry the same cold weight it once had. The fires burned brighter, or so it seemed to everyone who lived beneath that ancient roof, and the corridors that had once fallen silent at the mention of certain names now carried, occasionally, the sound of quiet laughter instead, a sound the house had gone without for far too long. Nathaniel had changed in ways both large and small since the truth had finally come to light. The careful, guarded formality that had once ruled every interaction had softened into something warmer, not because the weight of the dukedom had grown any lighter, but because he no longer carried the added burden of a grief he had never been allowed to properly grieve. He spoke of Julian often now, small stories shared freely over breakfast or in the quiet hours after supper, and each time he did, Elena saw a little more of the man Lady Beatrice had once described, warm where he had long been cold, quick to laugh where laughter had once seemed impossible. Margaret had chosen, in the end, to remain in the county rather than return to the coastal exile she had built for herself, taking a small cottage on the edge of the estate that Nathaniel had insisted, gently but firmly, she accept as some small measure of restitution for everything Roderick's cruelty had cost her. She visited Ashcombe Hall often, and though the visits were never entirely free of sorrow, given all that had been lost, they had become, over time, a source of genuine comfort rather than painful reminder, a chance for her to speak freely of the man she had loved, among people who had loved him too. Elena's own position within the household had shifted as well, quietly and gradually, in ways she had not fully anticipated when she first arrived at Ashcombe Hall in that terrible storm, soaked through and uncertain of what waited for her beyond those great doors. She remained Lady Beatrice's companion, a role she had come, genuinely, to cherish. But she found herself, increasingly, spending her evenings in the library with Nathaniel, no longer discussing ledgers and hidden diaries and the careful unraveling of a 6-year-old crime, but simply talking about books, about small hopes for the future, about nothing of any great importance at all, and finding, in those ordinary conversations, something she had not expected to find within these walls when Mrs. Bellamy first led her, wary and half frightened, up to the West Chamber on that first stormy night. It was in early spring, when the first green had begun to soften the harsh lines of the estate's gardens, that Nathaniel found her walking the same path where they had once discussed Julian's memory in careful, guarded whispers, and asked her, without any of the formality that had once defined every word between them, whether she might consider staying at Ashcombe Hall, not as a companion to his aunt, but as something rather more permanent. "I have spent 6 years believing this house was defined entirely by what it had lost," he said, taking her hands in his, beneath the pale spring sunlight. "You arrived, and within a matter of weeks, you helped me understand that a house is not only shaped by its grief, but by what it chooses to build afterward. I find, Elena, that I do not wish to build whatever comes next without you standing beside me." Elena thought of the storm that had carried her here, of the empty portrait turned to the wall, of the silver hairpin resting on the dressing table, as though waiting patiently for someone brave enough to ask why it had been left behind. And she thought, too, of everything that single question had eventually uncovered. 6 years of buried truth, finally allowed to breathe in the light. I did not come to Ashcombe Hall looking for anything more than a position and a roof over my head, she said softly. But I find I have discovered something here I never expected to find. Yes, Nathaniel, I will stay. The West Chamber, in time, was given over once more to guests, its shadows finally emptied of the grief that had haunted it for 6 long years, and the story of what had happened there, once a secret so carefully guarded that even asking about it invited only silence and closed doors, became instead a story told openly, a testament to what patience and courage and a refusal to leave difficult questions unanswered could ultimately uncover, even after the truth had been buried for years beneath layers of fear and careful, desperate silence. Julian's portrait remained turned outward in the great hall, his warm, laughing face welcoming every visitor who passed beneath it, no longer a wound the family flinched away from, but a memory finally allowed its rightful place among generations of Ashwoods who had come before, and those, like Elena, who would carry the family's story forward from here. And on quiet evenings, when the fire burned low in the library, and the house had settled into its familiar, comfortable silence, Elena would sometimes think back to that first terrible night, to the storm, and the empty frame, and the silver hairpin gleaming in the candlelight, and she would understand, with a certainty that had only grown stronger with every month that passed, that some rooms did indeed remember more than others, exactly as Lady Beatrice had once told her. But that memory, once finally given voice, no longer needed to be carried alone in the dark. It could, at last, be set down gently and shared, and allowed to become, in time, simply a part of the story a family chose to tell about who they had been, and who, together, they had finally chosen to become.